Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Time to talk about military doctrine, military history, the practices of military leaders, all by way of distilling from them lessons that we can apply to our business and professional lives. So, this is one of the ways that I do my best to give back to my fellow citizens for their support when I was in the military. I was in the Navy for a total of 16 years. And we meaning service members, we get so much training that's so valuable for us in the work that we do, and I want to bring that out to to all of you so that you get the benefit of you know really the huge amount of money that you spent training those of us in the military. And so today, I titled the show "Frozen by Philosophy." So over the last few weeks, I've been reading, or I finished reading a book, a very well known book about World War One called "The Guns of August." It's by Barbara Tuchman, and this is one of the seminal works on World War One, and it basically just covers the first month of the war. So this is before the United States is even involved in the war, because the war started in 1914, and the United States did not get involved until 1917. Okay, so it had been going on for several years. So at the beginning of World War One, basically Germany invaded France, partly through Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality, and in doing so, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, came into the war allied with France. Now, for those of you who recall your early American history, you'll know that the French and the English fought constantly, and that was the case until around kind of the middle of the 1800s, when Germany became the bigger threat. So in 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, that was kind of the first clash between France and Germany. And that actually, in some ways, set the stage for World War One. So the French army, in a post Franco-Prussian War, realized it needed to go through kind of a reform process, and eventually they ended up with something called the French Field Regulations of October 1913. Okay, it was in French. It was called the Règlement sur la conduite des grandes unités. Okay, and it was essentially setting out how the French military, essentially the army, was going to perform in the event of another war, right? And I have a copy of it right here. That's why I'm kind of glancing over here, because I want to make sure I'm giving it to you accurately. So the French field regulations laid out six principles, if you will. So number one was the offensive doctrine, meaning that the army was always going to be on offense, driving forward, forward, offense, offense, offense. That's what it was all about. And in doing so, they were going to take advantage of a characteristic that in French they called cran, and cran basically means like nerve, like guts almost. So all this sense of always being on offense, really. And you got to have the in Yiddish, it's like the kishkas, the guts to do this, right? And the French general staff really thought that with Caen, the French army would always be successful. They would always triumph over their enemies. Okay, the next part of it was infantry tactics, and it identified the infantry as being the primary military force in terms of use of formations, maneuvers, like bayonet charges. Now, if you can picture for a moment the idea in 1913 of making a bayonet charge against artillery, right? About how well would that work out, right? So you can already see that there's a philosophy here that is maybe somewhat detached from the technological reality of how war was going to be fought going forward. Okay, so artillery had been around for a long time. If you look at, for example, the American Civil War, we had cannons and that sort of thing. As we move farther through the 1800s, we got into things, mobile artillery that could lay down, shells at a high rate, right? And it became much more devastating, a much more important weapon. Another very important weapon was the invention of the machine gun. So again, picture a bayonet charge against machine guns. How well is that going to work out? Okay, so but that was the second part of it. The third was artillery support. So it stressed the critical role of artillery in preparing and supporting an infantry attack. Okay, so it was kind of a combined arms idea. Okay, but maybe not as frankly useful as it could have been. Next was the command and control, the decision making process. How that all that was going to work, and and in practice, the way it worked out was the general in charge of the overall operation, really everything had to be approved by him. Now, in terms of at least the strategy and the operations. Now, that's of course not always how things work. There were times when subordinate generals would do what they thought they needed to do, even if they had been ordered to do something else. But there wasn't necessarily a sense of the person closest to the battle is the person best positioned to know what needs to happen in terms of victory. So it was a tighter command and control structure than you would typically see. Well, first of all, in the American military today, but really in the American military even at that time. So there was much more of a sense of, here's the objective, now you figure out how to meet the objective. Okay, so that was another part. Okay, 5, mobility and flexibility. So this was sort of played into this idea of always be on the offensive, stay flexible, mobile, always keep moving, and you will win. And then finally, morale and discipline. So the idea was, as long as we kept tight discipline and high morale, we were going to win. Now, for those of you who know how World War I worked out, right, it's most famous for being a trench warfare war. And it pretty quickly settled down into that. And in fact, when I called this show Frozen by Philosophy, what I mean was that when the Germans invaded Belgium and France, the French, well, the Belgian army really, it wasn't that big, it wasn't that strong, so it pretty quickly retreated. It knew it had to. It didn't have the same philosophy as the French army. Um, but when the Germans initially collided with the French army, it really sort of set the French back on their heels, because the doctrine was always to attack, and yet they were essentially being overwhelmed by the German army. And so they they had to retreat, otherwise they would have essentially been wiped out. But the idea of retreat was so foreign to the philosophy of the French army that it caused a great deal of consternation among the various armies and corps and divisions that made up the French armies, the overall French military effort, I should say. And so the ability to regroup so that they could go back on the offensive was really delayed, to the point where the Germans came pretty close to conquering France all the way to Paris. Now, Paris is the capital of France, and if the Germans had gotten into Paris in World War I, the way they did in World War II, it's not at all clear that the French could have stayed active in World War I. So then, and the Germans plan was basically to be in Paris within like 36 to 40 days was their time frame. And the idea was just to basically overwhelm the French and have this quick victory. And if they had accomplished that, then they would basically be able to take over the rest of Western Europe. So by having this very uncompromising philosophy, the French army really put themselves in a hole. They did themselves a disservice. So how do we then take this and use this in our own businesses, our professions? So I've been thinking a lot about this, in preparation for doing this show, and this is the idea that I came up with. So I sometimes I think we look at a philosophy and we say, well, a philosophy should be unbending because it's our philosophy. I disagree with that. I think what we need to be mostly unbending about is our values. And if our values are long considered and deeply held, that's what we need to hang on to. So if I were the French in World War I, my value would be the maintenance of France. France will always exist. That would be the existence of France. That's what I would value first and foremost. So then philosophy and we'll call it action, those both have to give way in the face of staying true to my values. Okay. Now, in this case, you could say the value is somewhat of a goal, and I think that works equally well. So in our businesses, hopefully, our goals are coming out of our values. Okay. So if our values are money is the most important thing, which I frankly hope that's not your values, but if that's your values, right? So then that will lead you to a certain philosophy and a certain set of actions. But if that philosophy and if those actions are not getting you to your goal, then one or both of them needs to change. Okay? So I'll give you an example from my business career. So when I was a young man, I was raised with this idea that wealthy people became wealthy by cheating. Okay, that was a philosophy that I was given, and I absorbed it. I frankly didn't know any better, right? So then I got into business, and in the real estate business, who do you need to do business with? Well, primarily wealthy people, right? So I'm in a situation where I had to my goal was to be successful in the real estate business, right? My philosophy was the people I need to work with to be successful are all crooks. Do you see a problem there? My philosophy was conflicted with my goal. Okay? And so I had to reconsider, was my philosophy correct? Was it true? And over the first couple of years that I struggled after I started my business, I met a lot of wealthy people, most of whom didn't do business with me. Okay. But I did get to know some of them. And what I found was most of them were honest people. They had worked hard, and that's how they became successful. Yeah, there were definitely some wealthy people who were unsavory characters at best. But this sort of class struggle ideology was not true. And so I had to give up that philosophy. Right? Now imagine you're a wealthy person, a prospective client, and I'm presenting to you and I have this underlying animosity toward you. Are you going to want to do business with me? I don't think so, right? So therein lies the rub. And once I changed my philosophy and I realized that what I wanted was to work with people who shared my values, and there were lots of wealthy people who shared my values, then I started having success, right? So we don't want to be frozen by philosophy because that will as likely impede our success as it will strengthen it. Okay. Um, Now, the same thing is true, by the way, of actions. So I had the same issue in my business. I was committed to doing certain things in my business that at first worked pretty well, but when the market changed, I kept taking the same actions, but I was getting different, i.e., much poorer results. Okay. And what I realized then was the actions I take need to be appropriate within the framework of what's happening in the market at that time. Okay. Now, again, I stayed true to my values, but I had to change my philosophy, which was I know how to be successful. Right. This is how you be successful. You do these things. That was my philosophy. But that wasn't right. Again, I was frozen by philosophy. And it wasn't until I could unfreeze my philosophy that I could also change my actions and go on to even more success. Right. So this is the lesson of France almost losing in the first little over a month in World War One. So the Règlement sur le conduit des grandes utilités, unité, the French field regulations of October 1913 set forth this philosophy of how the French army should act. And in doing so, it almost lost France. Now, what's interesting is the Ferdinand Foch, who was the generalissimo of the French army, the top general of French army, His philosophy was, yeah, let them take Paris. Who cares, right? Whereas General Gallieni, who was charged with defense of Paris by the French government, realized that at the heart of France was Paris. And to lose Paris was very much to present to the people of France that France was lost. So he understood the fundamental goal, and he fought against being frozen by that philosophy. And I see that in many businesses where people confuse sticking with a philosophy for they make sticking with the philosophy the goal as opposed to making the goal, right? And again, the goal should be based on our values. So the best thing we can do is to examine our goal. If we're achieving it, okay, good. Just be aware that as conditions and situations change, we probably are going to have to change tactics. We're probably going to have to change actions, which may require a change in philosophy. So we don't want to let philosophy and actions freeze us in a way that then makes us unable to achieve our goals. We want it the other way around. Here's the goal. What are the philosophies and actions necessary to support it? And if we have a philosophy or if we're taking an action that isn't supporting the goal, then we have to examine that and see how does it need to change, keeping in mind that there is a sort of inner working. We don't want to adopt a philosophy or a goal that is counter to our values, but we want to adopt a philosophy. We want to adopt. We want to adapt is the word I'm looking for. We want to adapt our philosophy in concurrence with our goals, but in concurrence with our values in a way that will support our goals. So that's the lesson, if you will, of the French field regulations of October 1913, and indeed of the French involvement in World War I. So I thank you very much for joining me today. Hope you found this interesting. If you have any thoughts, criticisms, do share them on our social media. All the links will be in the show notes after the show posts. And if you have, something private or personal, my email address will also be in the show notes. So feel free to shoot me an email, and I will respond as long as it's within my area of knowledge. If it's something outside my area of knowledge, I'll do my best to refer you to someone I think can help you. And while we're talking about show notes in the YouTube channel, if you're not a subscriber, please do consider subscribing. And that way you'll know every time a new show starts and you won't miss any of the Way to Wow shows. So including, for example, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And we're going to talk about how taxes affect you. This is beyond what you pay each April 15th, or at least what you've paid by, the end of the year that then you file a return for on April 15th. This is not the only way that taxes affect our lives. And so I think it's a good thing for us to understand the broader picture of taxation and its impact on the economy and us. So we're going to talk about that tomorrow on People Making Money at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And then next Monday at 10 a.m. is my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly. And then I'll be back 7 days from today for the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. Okay. And then Next week on Thursday is my every other week show, Jiggers' Place. This is at 5 p.m. Pacific time on every other Thursday. So it'll be next week, will be this next show. And we sit back for a half an hour. We have a cocktail or two, and we talk about books, life, ideas, all the things that enrich our lives beyond professional and business pursuits. So it's an opportunity to kind of relax before the weekends officially, and kind of delve into some of these other portions. It takes the Way to Wow shows back to their roots. So again, I thank you very much for joining me today. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and signing off. Marie, you are my belle. Courage at all times,